This is Eileen Griffin with the Heartland View from the Heartland Daily News, bringing you public policy stories that affect your life, your health, your freedom, and the nation's economy. We're going to jump right in this week because there's a number of different stories. There's kind of a wide range of things to cover. And as always, I'm just going to go over them briefly. If you want more details and more information, please look at each of these stories on the website heartlanddailynews.com. But first of all, on the budget and tax page, we'll do a quick overview of what's happening in the economy. So we saw the numbers for June looked good. We saw continued growth. We've seen this going on for quite some time. We know that part of this is this ongoing sugar high, the input of the loose monetary policy, as well as stimulus money into the system. However, we are also seeing that there's a slowdown in terms of there's a demand that can't be met. So we're seeing supply chain disruption. And so there's certain shortages that we're already seeing, and inflationary pressure is building. Now, the Biden economic team has actually put out some information as well in terms of their economic projections. So the Biden economic team thinks that we're probably going to have about 2 more years of growth because, again, they've even acknowledged it's part of this ongoing stimulus and input of monetary support into the system. So even the Biden team's acknowledging that there's a anticipated slowdown that will happen. They basically have said that they anticipate for about 2 more years because of the input that the federal government has had into the economy. And as he says, this once artificially high stimulus-juiced measurement of GDP, once that subsides in about 2 years from now, they anticipate a much slower rate of growth, probably less than 2%. And that team is projecting that for about 10 years. So that's a significant amount of time to see that level of slow growth. And this coming out of the Biden administration, so you can assume they continue to spend, they continue to come up with more and more proposals that are massive, massive government spending. So anticipate that if they think we're going to have slow growth, there's probably a pretty good reason they would assume that. So after this sugar high, reality will set in. And economist Dr. Mark Henderson says a more accurate description for this slow growth is progressive stagnation. He says, quote, "The coming stagnation isn't foreordained. It is simply the inevitable outcome of a progressive agenda that exalts big government and disdains free enterprise. It is the bitter fruit of the socialist mindset that despises private property order and craves top-down economic planning, whereby government elites decree what should be produced, such as electric cars, wind, solar energy, even if that's not what citizens want or can afford," end quote. And that's one of the big debate points, of course, is the difference between socialism and capitalism. If you'd like to learn more about that or share resources with other people that might help them understand more about the socialist versus capitalist mindset, please have them check out the website Stopping Socialism off of the heartland.org webpage. But we're going to move on. Next topic is a little bit about the Supreme Court, some of the rulings that have come down, some interesting things happening there. So in the news, Seton Motley, president of Less Government, has said that, oh my goodness, the U.S. Supreme Court, they find things unconstitutional, but then they let it continue to happen. So he finds that shocking. It does certainly seem shocking, or at least unusual. So he says the U.S. Supreme Court has developed a weird habit of declaring federal laws, regulation, and executive branch actions unconstitutional, but yet allowing them to continue. And he gives a couple of examples. The CFPB, for one, if you're not familiar with that organization, that's the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And that was born after the last recession, 2007, 2008. It was really the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren. She pushed this agenda. What it is essentially is another agency to oversee all the financial institutions. Now, they've been looking at this for quite some time and saying this is really an unconstitutional organization, and it's just really the way it's set up. There's a lot of lack of oversight. It's really run as a pretty much an independent organization. So the Supreme Court agreed and said, yes, it is unconstitutional. However, the CFPB will live to see another day, as they will continue to survive, but in spite of the Supreme Court ruling. So very interesting. The other thing that's come out of the Supreme Court that is part of the CFPB, or at least they've had some hand in it, is this idea of extending the moratorium on rent. So Stephen Moore also has an article about this. It's very fascinating. He's questioning, well, what about property rights? So if you look at this extension, the Supreme Court upheld it, that the government has the right to have a moratorium on rent. And this rent, you're talking about not rent paid to the government, rent paid to private citizens who own private property. So landlords, people that have bought apartment buildings or condos or houses or whatever it is, they're renting them out. And the government has said, well, but your renters don't have to pay rent. So that's interesting given that this is private property. So how can that be? Now, the original reason why they came up with this idea of a moratorium was to not have people kicked out of their apartment when they couldn't pay rent because they couldn't work because of the pandemic. Well, that's no longer the case. In fact, now there are so many job openings, they're desperate to find people, desperate to hire people, and yet some people won't go back to work. Why? Well, because the government continues to pay them extra in some states to not go back to work. But at this point, to not pay rent doesn't make sense. And who ends up holding the bag? So again, it's the private property owner. So the renter decides not to pay. That doesn't mean the private property owner doesn't still have obligations. Those people still have to pay. If they have a mortgage, they have to pay their mortgage. If they have other expenses tied to their property, they're paying that property, all those property expenses. But yet their renter isn't doing their part. So that seems to be quite unusual in our situation where we're used to being able to think we have private property, have rights to decide. And of course, if you think you have problems now with homelessness and lack of affordable housing, just wait until you see all these landlords get out of the landlord business because they can't make any money. And it's basically a pointless effort at this point. So interesting article if you want to see again the whole thing. Stephen Moore on heartlanddailynews.com under the budget and tax section. So one other piece of information that I think is really interesting to share with you today is what's happening in Minneapolis. Now, we all know that in Minneapolis, they've had crime off the charts. So it's been just very sad to watch the city deteriorate and all these citizens sitting there just victimized. So what's happened is some citizens, about 8 citizens of Minneapolis, took the city council to court and said, you're violating our rights because you're not fulfilling the city charter and putting our lives in danger. And the court has said that they are correct and that the city council is required to hire more police officers. So, good news for the people of Minneapolis. They will finally get some more police officers on the job, and that's necessary. So again, it hasn't been a mystery. Everybody that's watched this, and now there's documented proof showing they've been able to track this. Where there were fewer police officers, there's higher crime. And where there are more police officers, less crime. Again, not exactly a difficult thing to consider. Now, tangent to this, John Stossel has an article about right to bear arms and your right as an individual citizen of this country to have a firearm. Now, as you know, it varies state by state. So before the Supreme Court now is a case that says everybody needs to be treated the same. Everybody's rights are under the Constitution. And Stossel said there's a good chance this will actually happen, which will universalize everybody's rights in terms of owning a gun. Now, people against us say more guns on the street will create more crime. But the data actually suggests the opposite, that when there are more citizens, armed citizens with weapons, and in places where they have concealed carry and other rights along those lines, what you see is crime goes down. Why? Well, because criminals are looking for the easy opportunity. They're looking for the path of least resistance. They want someone that's an easy target, an easy victim. Well, when there's more police, like we just said with Minneapolis, it's harder for criminals. They face more potential confrontation. But an armed citizenry is the same thing. An armed citizen can also protect and defend themselves. And so again, that gives a criminal a little bit more hesitation, knowing that they could meet with resistance as opposed to just being able to bowl over a victim who has no ability to protect themselves. So this is another interesting case. Like I said, no shortage of interesting things happening this week in public policy news. So thank you as always for listening. I've gone through these things very quickly. There's a lot of detail on heartlanddailynews.com if you'd like to review these stories. Also, if you'd like to help the organization that is providing this information, trying to keep you informed, especially in these times when there's just so much happening, please go to the website, heartland.org. You can make a donation right on the homepage. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.